Tonight, we are thrilled to be exploring youth cultures in film and performance, and we're so grateful that Adelina and Frances are able to join us. Frances is a lecturer in film studies at the University of Sussex. Her research interests include contemporary youth cinemas, girlhood, and genre cinema. She is the author of Bain de Fil, Girlhood Identities in Contemporary France, and Rethinking the Hollywood Teen Movie. Frances has a collection on the films of John Hughes, co-edited with Timothy Sherry, forthcoming in 2021. Adelina completed her PhD at the Royal Central School of Speech and Drama, University of London, in 2018. Her thesis, Compassionate Mobilities, proposes a theory for negotiated living inspired by parkour, art du déplacement, breaking, breakdancing, and graffiti. She has published in Theatre, Dance and Performance Training Journal and Research in Drama Education, the Journal of Applied Theatre and Performance. And she's recently co-edited a special issue of Ride on Access with Colette Conroy and Dirk Rodericks, which was also later published as an edited collection under Routledge. We're so delighted that they're joining us, and we will begin with Frances Smith's paper.
Yeah, so welcome along to this. It's a work in progress, and it's all about sport, genre, and the body in this. So as it'll become apparent, it's my contention that the film's presentation of various sports in her youth cinemas in particular are significant to her consideration of the gendered body and the film's generic positioning as well. So Céline Sciamma's most widely known and celebrated film, Bain de Fil, or Girlhood as it's known in Anglophone markets, begins with a sequence that seems designed to hoodwink its viewers. And it's one that really puzzled me for quite a long time when I was writing my book on this. I didn't really know what to make of the sequence, and it's taken me some time to come to terms with it. And maybe I'm still coming to terms with it. So what I thought I would do is subject you all to this. And this black box here is a clip. So I'll play this for you now, and then I'll talk more about this particular sequence. So that I could say is the film's opening sequence, and it's a real sort of Yeah, it's one that surprises you. And as Tonya was saying earlier before we came on to this talk, it's one that you think, are you in the right place? Is it the right film that you're expecting to see? So we find ourselves in this opening scene positioned at the end of an American football game, played with skill and strength. And though there are clues in the hair and the figures of the players, it's only at the very end of the sequence, when the players remove their heavy headgear, that we're taken aback, or at least I was, to discover that they, as we might be expected, the players are female rather than male, which I might be expected for a sport whose leagues are solely professionally played by men. Moreover, we're not in the United States of America, but in France on the southeast fringes of Paris. So not only is this the opening sequence of the film, but moreover that which heralds the film as a whole, this title card that you see at the very end, appearing immediately afterwards, suggesting that the sequence is a declaration of intent for the film, or perhaps a literal description of what a bande de filles or a girl gang might look like. Yet while the film clearly shows their skill and collaboration in playing the sport, the floodlights quickly go out shortly after the game is concluded, not even giving the girls time to actually vacate the field or finish their celebrations. They play in some kind of stadium, but there's nobody in the bleachers and no one is officiating this seemingly official match here. Instead, they leave the stadium in darkness, and as the scene concludes, the girls are gradually silently and chanting, very vociferous, very loud, and they get gradually quieter as they go back home through their housing estate. For the many times I've seen this film, the sequences continue to fascinate me and got me thinking about the role of team sports throughout Shyama's youth films, and in what they tell us about the cultural role of sport in the regulation of young bodies, but also about the positioning of the films themselves within structures of genre. So before we get into this, I just want to have a quick sort of run through of Shyama's work as a whole, for those who might not be quite so familiar with her. But Shyama's career as a director and screenwriter of feature films began in 2007 with Naissance des Pieuvres, or Water Lilies, which sees the development of an intense relationship between two teenage girls. This was followed in 2011 by Tomboy, which showed the gender fluidity of a much younger child who decides to assume an identity as a boy when her family moves to a new area. And in 2014, we have Girlhood, which portrays the central character Mariem, played by Karija Torre, being drawn into and then breaking away from a group of girls in the Parisian banlieue. Shyama's latest film, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, is not focused on youth, as you might have noticed if you've seen it, but does otherwise share many of Shyama's characteristic preoccupations with the gaze, the female desire, and the creation of closed-off spaces in which outside influences cannot particularly impinge, such that these nascent relationships might flourish. Her work as a screenwriter, and this is how her career initially began, she trained as a screenwriter. This continues her preoccupation with questions of youth, the screenplay for André Tequine's Being 17, and for Claude Barris's stop-motion animation My Life as a Courgette, which questioned the issues that could reasonably be tackled in a children's film. So for the most part then, with the exception of Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which we park to one side for now, Shyama's film directing work and indeed screenwriting work has been concerned with questions of youth and identity. She has earned a reputation for sensitivity in her portrayal of youth on screen, and in particular in her treatment of gender fluidity as well. So let's go. A good place to start then with our examination of sports in Shyama's youth films is by focusing firstly on Water Lilies, a debut feature film which places sport at its centre in the form of synchronized swimming, which looks a little bit like the images on the screen here. As with American football, with which Girlhood begins, sport in Water Lilies is very highly gendered. Shyama points out in interviews that synchronized swimming remains one of the only two sports in which only women are permitted to participate at professional or Olympic level. If you wonder what the other one is, it's rhythmic gymnastics. The synchronized swimming, therefore, provides a particularly pertinent arena in which to examine the regulation of the female body and the representational burden of young femininity as well. Sports scholars Amanda Roth and Susan A. Bazow observe that, in common with other female-dominated sports, such as gymnastics and figure skating, performance of femininity itself is required of its participants. Synchronized swimming likewise requires awards marks for grace and poise, terms that denote the participants' instantiation of feminine norms while they're competing in their sport. What is more, these sports require their participants to perform their routine smiling. In other words, emotional labor that would disavow the physical efforts of their endeavors, and also wearing full makeup. And you can see some of that in the images on screen here. This is Floriane on the right of your screen, very sort of hot, full makeup. It's not a natural look that she's going for there. So Roth and Bazard term this phenomenon the feminine apologetic, since the purpose of all this is to mitigate the supposedly disturbing spectacle of female athleticism in favor of uncomplicated sexual spectacle. And for Judith Franco, who is writing much later about this, the spectacle of this is one of effortlessness, one that requires significant amounts of labour, which must then in turn be disavowed as no labour at all. This, you might argue, is a model of post-feminist femininity, of hyper-surveillance on the body. As you can see in this image, this is, if you look at the image on the left, these women are not competing at the time. This is a ritual inspection of the girls' armpit shaving. Have they done it well enough? So this is the routine surveillance of the body that is required as part of this sport. And it needs to be, of course, to some extent freely chosen, and to a less extent in this at least, fun as well. So tellingly, despite many of these sports having been infiltrated by men, things like gymnastics, certainly, these elements are not required of male competitors. So it tells us that it's something that's very much exclusive to female competitors doing these types of sports. So all of this makes synchronized women an especially fruitful arena for representing the disciplinary regimes faced by women and the representational burden of young women in particular. So I want to think about this a bit further. And Siamo dramatized the disciplinary regimes of synchronized swimming and is attentive to the ways in which they manifest elsewhere in cultural discourse. So one notable example, quite a surreal example, but an interesting one, is a girl who reprimands Floriane, who's played by Adèle Haenel, the captain of the synchronized swimming team, for eating a banana in the changing rooms. So for this girl, who remains unnamed, eating a banana always has sexual connotations, which cannot be dispelled by eating it in a single-sex space, that is the female changing rooms. Her solution is to mash the banana into what she called a disgusting pulp, so that not only can be no phallic suggestion to her eating a banana, but sadly the girl also derives absolutely no pleasure from eating the fruit at all. So this rather surreal moment draws attention to the ways in which girls are always regarded as being on display, even when they're in what I would regard as quite a backstage space, in which the male gaze cannot intrude. So Siamo draws attention to the scrutiny under which the girls perform, not only in their sport, but in other spheres of their lives as well. What is more, though, in her use of these backstage settings, she also gives us sufficient proximity to the characters to undercut the construction of spectacular, regularized, and somehow effortless femininity that synchronized swimming seems to create and to display. Thus, when the girls perform their routine, as we can see on the screen here, Siamo's camera only fleetingly shows them in long shot, which should give you the sort of whole spectacle of the scene, the skill of the performance. Instead, we get these very fragmented medium close-ups. We don't ever get to see the routine in it to its whole extent, and we don't get to see how it would necessarily need to be seen for it to match with the music and all that type of stuff there either. So we get these very close shots really of the synchronized swimmer. And as a result of this, we can hear the girl's ragged breathing, we can hear the water splashing, all these sounds and noises that should otherwise be abated by the synchronized swimmers themselves. And we also get this view of the makeup and this gelatinous hair lacquer and their rictus grins that they're required to perform as well. They're not really intended to be seen at close quarters. It's meant to be part of an overall wider spectacle. The proximity of Siamo's camera arguably has three principal effects here. She undercuts the supposed effortless in the girls' synchronized swimming by foregrounding their athletic labor. You can hear how heavily they're breathing. You can always hear that when it's going on. And you can see the emotional labor of what they're doing. You can see the sort of the elements of the grotesque in the hair lacquer and these strange grins and nose clips they have on. It doesn't look like a very sort of effortless smile. It looks like a grimace when we see it at close quarters here. He also disrupts the assumed male gaze of the sport by portraying it from the point of view of Marie, from a queer girl's perspective here. And she demonstrates the violence towards female bodies that was required to undergird this performance of spectacular, supposedly effortless femininity. So Siama's representation of the sport is in no small part a political gesture, if you like, sort of foregrounding the labor of the process of this sport. So I'm going to turn now to football in Tomboy, quite a different sport here. So known as soccer in the United States, football is practiced by people of all different types of genders. Nonetheless, it remains a highly gendered sport and is principally associated with men and boys, particularly in Europe, it must be said. And it performs a key part of the gender politics of Tomboy here. Because the sport remains primarily thought of as a masculine one, the representational codes are rather different from those of synchronized swimming. Whereas fans might admire the grace and elegance of particular players or any particular, don't even know the word, moves that they might do, they're by no means the principal criteria for judging players' ability in football. So when Laure, played by Zoe Hérin, you can see her in the red shorts in these pictures here, arrives in her new neighborhood, she seizes the chance to recast her identity as a boy, Michael, when they are mistaken as such by Lisa, played by Jeanne Disson. As a result, Laure goes by the name Michael with her new friends, and the neighborhood children, who are principally boys, who really determine the terms under which social interaction takes place, and this occurs principally through football. So the film shows the football to be the domain of the boys. You can see in all these shots, it's all boys who are playing it together here. And for their part, Michael or Laure finds that football serves as a useful arena in which to mimic the gestures that denote boyish or masculine behaviour. Siama's shaky handheld camera finds one of the boys spitting after performing a particular athletic manoeuvre in football. And soon after, in close-up, we see Laure both watch this and do the same when she comes to playing it herself. Football is both the space in which Laure's identity as Michael is most assured, but also at risk of discovery as well. And in this, the narrative of Tomboy can be seen to follow many of the markers of the transgender coming-of-age narrative. So that these scenes taking place in front of the mirror, you can see that on the top right-hand side of your screen, and the fashioning of a prosthetic phallus, which when Laure Michael realizes that going swimming with the group will leave their body subject to greater scrutiny than they might be comfortable with. These kind of narrative beats also occur in Ma Vie en Rose by Alain Berliner, and also common to films featuring much older characters, such as Kimberly Peirce's Boys Don't Cry and Tom Hooper's overwrought and frankly terrible The Danish Girl. So football in these terms is one more arena in which Laure's gender fluidity can find expression here. So, although many scenes in Tomboy possess a clear sense of play, and the football is a clear part of this, the film is often at pains to stress the supposedly natural, in inverted commas, and the biological terms in which gender takes place. The central character's mother, tellingly credited simply as la mère, or the mother, is heavily pregnant, a state that clearly emphasizes the woman's biological femininity, if you like. And it is she that demands that Laure desist in her identity as a boy and requires her to go and visit all her friends' homes, one by one, wearing a dress, in order to reveal her supposedly true self. So one principle, a further means through which the film insists on the supposedly natural is through its setting. You can see the film's football games take place in this rather green space whose lushness Sharma's camera conveys through shots looking up through the trees and in through this very wooded landscape. So in this, the boys' football game is granted the semblance of naturalness or rightness in their behaviour, in spite of their violence towards Laure towards the end of the film. Such positioning of the natural within Tomboy parallels the boys' own questions assimilation of the rules of football, and with it other norms of behaviour as well. At the end of the film, the boys claim that for Lisa to have kissed Mikhail, now discovered to be a girl, is disgusting. The boys' conventionality contrasts with the imagination and generosity of the female characters, notably Laura's younger sister Jeanne, played by Marlon Levana. Football, there might be regarded as a citational practice, whose rules and norms are assimilated over time. And in a similar way, Sciamma's film likewise suggests that heteronormative gender roles are likewise an equivalent citational practice. This representation of the lush, natural spaces of the children's neighbourhood calls attention to the film's temporal setting in the summer months, one that Tomboy shares with water lilies. Summer holds a privileged position in nostalgic narratives about youth, yet it is striking that in American teen cinema, to which Sciamma frequently alludes, and continues to dominate representations of youth, the high school remains the most frequent setting. As such, it is revealed that Sciamma has rejected this adult-controlled setting in favour of environments in which youths create their own rules with a particular ecosystem of norms as well. It is in these liminal moments between school years that Sciamma situates the radical fluidity and possibilities for youth. For Laura, that means assuming the guise of a boy, Mikhail, and the behaviours that go with that. In Water Lilies, the heightened moment between academic years allows the development of an intense relationship between Florian and Marie. And in Girlhood, the narrative only properly kicks off once the educational establishment has rejected Marianne as well. Notably in Tomboy, it seems to be the oncoming bureaucracy of the school year rather than intolerance that compels Laura's mother to deny her identity as Mikhail and to resume her place as Laura. The danger presented by the school for Laura's identity is seen earlier when Lisa asks Mikhail about his school enrolment, seeing as he doesn't appear to be registered and there's only one school group per year. It does not seem to occur to the characters to negotiate with the school's bureaucracy or to accommodate Laura's gender fluidity. The Sciamma just thus insists on the possibilities when youth are left largely without the interference of adults and institutions that control young people. And in generic terms, Sciamma finds herself positioned between the American teen move and French youth cinema as well. So let's go back then to our American football players. So as I mentioned previously, it's a rather odd moment in the film, and it's never really referred to by any of the characters subsequently. They never mention their love of American football at any point. For Umar Amadou, the central problem with Girlhood is that Sciamma equates blackness with Americanness throughout the film, such that blackness seems to be wholly foreign to Frenchness or French identity. And this is how Amadou reads the opening American football game. A sport which here is presented as wholly distinct from the remainder of the narrative, which is little practiced in France, is seen here played predominantly, although not exclusively, by black girls. Furthermore, the gender politics of the sport and the way it's portrayed in the scene invite the perception that the players are male, perhaps complicating the racialized politics of girlhood itself, which remains a largely white, heteronormative imaginary. Amadou's comments chimes with the use of transnational, or rather American really, music produced by black artists throughout the film, the apex of which of course is Rihanna's Diamonds, an extended sequence towards the middle of the film. Faced with criticisms of her work, Sciamma has argued that her film addresses the absence of black girls on screen, and arguably the debates that the film has provoked and the attention that the film has received would perhaps not have come about were it not for this film. She's also commented on the absence of key markers of identity in the film, having purged all references to the police, to the religion, and to race. In other words, the principal markers of the banlieue film. This is part of Sciamma's attempt not to associate the girls with a French youth film, which she finds to be too preoccupied by struggles against authority, and towards her idea of what constitutes the American teen movie, which she argues features worlds that exist, quote, according to their own rules, end quote. So, violence then. American football, of course, is known for its violence and for its propensity for head injuries in particular, as a result of which players wear heavy protective gear that emphasizes their, usually at least, masculine frame. Then if we turn to all three of these sports, it's striking that they feature various types of bodily and ultimately symbolic violence, which in itself tells us something about the youthful body and its molding within culture. In synchronized swimming, the violence consists of the rigid performance of femininity and subjecting the girls to a masculinized gaze. This is made apparent in scenes in which the girls' depalatory efforts are routinely inspected by the team's coach, and you can see that again in the picture on the right. In Tomboy, there is some measure of play fighting among the characters, as well as a limited violence sanctioned as part of the game of football, which isn't terribly violent normally. And Girlhood likewise shows the violence of American football, although this is jubilant and quite collective in character. It's surely significant that the girls participate in ritualized street fights against other girls later in the film, owing to which these two forms of violence are brought into sharp contrast, actually. Jessica Ringrose and Valerie Walkerdine, among others, have noted the ways in which girls who participate in violence or display aggression are doubly pathologized by virtue not only of their violation of the norms of social conduct, but also their violation of gender norms as well, since so-called relational aggression is the mode that is sanctioned among girls and women, particularly in post-feminist culture. There is thus a distinct contrast drawn in the film between the world of violence that is sanctioned among the masculinized world of American football and perhaps sports more widely, and the individuated street fights that pit girls against one another in gladiatorial arena. So, throughout this presentation, I've referred to sport as a way through which the girls' treatment of gender might be viewed. But what can they tell us about the Shyama's treatment of genre? As I mentioned previously, Shyama is especially keen to root her work as a play on the American teen movie. Perhaps surprisingly, she likens Water Lilies to 1999 sex quest romp American Pie. A number of scholars have positioned her films as part of what they call the cinéma du milieu, sort of midway between American genre film and French coded auteur cinema, identifying the ways in which Shyama adds an auteurist twist to the established genre formula of American teen cinema. However, I argue that the various ways in which team sports are used throughout her work are a clear signal to how she regards her own films and their positioning and predefined generic structures. Like genre, sports might be regarded as a citational practice in that participants follow a predetermined set of rules and norms, must practice them on several occasions in order to become adept at those. So this, alongside Shyama's ability to use sports in order to create the youth-governed ecosystem absent of the regularizing constraints or confrontational elements offered by parents, the police, or school, which are common to French youth cinemas. So to finish, this will be my final comment. We might argue that Shyama's attention to team sports perhaps points to adolescence as some kind of form of citational practice, or maybe filmic adolescence is more apt here, whose participants attempt to adhere to or to diverge from the rules of the game. And that's it. And just before I'm done, I just want to highlight our symposium that we're running next month on Celine Sciamma. There'll be more of that stuff, and there'll be some other people talking as well that are going to be more interesting even than that. So yeah, it'd be nice to see some of you there as well on the 9th of December. But I'll stop sharing that now. Get in touch with me afterwards if that's interesting to you.
From as early as January 2020, there have been reports of violent racism directed towards East Asians in the UK. On 9th February 2020, a Thai tax consultant, Pawat Silawatakun, was called coronavirus while being filmed by 2 teenagers. He was then robbed and punched in the nose. It was late afternoon in West London and there were bystanders, but no one tried to intervene. On 24th February, Jonathan Mock, a Singaporean student studying in the UK, was assaulted on Oxford Street. One said, "I don't want your coronavirus in my country," during the attack, which left Mock with fractures on his face that now require surgery. Apparently, a survey of 26,000 people in 25 countries designed by the YouGov Cambridge Globalism Project found that 1 in 5 British respondents believed that it was definitely or probably true that COVID-19 had been deliberately created and spread by the Chinese government. On a train in mid-February, 2 young people sitting behind me started behaving strangely as I stood on to put up my coat. One hyperventilated very loudly and said, "Oh my God," repeatedly, while the other stared at me with muscles tensed, ready to fight. I might have stared back at them questioningly, only realizing later that that this was a reaction to the fear my appearance must have aroused. I no longer dare to stare back at people who equate East Asians to COVID-19. I keep my head bowed and I move quickly on. I feel dislocated in a way I have not felt before, even though I've been living in the UK for 8 years on different visas with limited leave to remain. In autotopography, graffiti, landscapes, and selves, Deirdre Hedren describes her approach to autotopography as the location of a particular individual in actual space, a locatedness that has implications for both subject and place. Here, this locatedness is realized through the performative writing of identity through graffiti that articulates rejection. In this pandemic, East Asians are treated as superspreaders of COVID-19. Extending Hedden's definition of autotopography, the heightened visibility given to my appearance as a Chinese person in London, regardless of how I actually identify as a Singaporean Peranakan, brings with it fresh understanding of dislocatedness in this city that once championed diversity as a fundamental part of its identity. I've stopped traveling on my own. I've even asked colleagues if I might walk with them to the train station. In asking, I inevitably begin autotopographical conversations about violent racism triggered by COVID-19 that is directed towards East Asians in the UK. I hope this walk reads as a performance of resistance to those who blame Chinese people for the COVID-19 pandemic and the COVID-19 induced recession. Even though this autotopographical walk painfully contextualizes this experience of dislocatedness, I hope that the conversations we have had about place will be shared with others who perpetuate racist conspiracy theories about the origin of COVID-19. So, Art du Déplacement, which can translate as the art of displacement, is a playful exploration of public spaces. Developed by a group of teenagers in France who eventually called themselves the Yamakasi. Yamakasi means strong man, strong spirit in Lingala, a Bantu language from Congo-Kinshasa and Congo-Brazzaville. The pioneers of Art du Déplacement are Chao Bell Din, Yen Nautra, Williams Bell, and Laurent Piementossi. In Art du Déplacement, playful exploration of familiar place can transform an overlooked urban feature like a park bench into a place of beauty. Extending Salimaki's place practices, which can trouble the meanings of place, destabilizing suppositions of locality, dwelling, inhabitation, territory, indigeneity, community, residence, belonging, connection, and ownership, the Art du Déplacement applied performance practices I use are designed to create counter-narratives of place. So, I usually begin by sending participants some sort of a pre-session task that invites them to use furniture, clothes, or food from their homes to create a sculpture that represents their fear. I demonstrate this by putting 2 chairs next to one another, one upright and the other lying on its back with chairs facing the participants, as if it had fallen backwards. I sit myself on the edge of the seat of the fallen chair and look towards the upright chair with my head bowed. In these sessions, I've chosen to explain what my fear sculpture means in order to disrupt preconceived notions of the facilitator as someone who has no fear. I then tell the participants that they do not need to reveal what their fear sculpture means. I'm only articulating my fears so they might undertake a similar thought process in the creation of their own fear sculptures. The abstract sculpture is intended as a means of creating ambiguity that enables participants to express their fears without feeling too exposed. This fear sculpture used to represent my fear of becoming a zombie migrant. For Sarah Ahmed, the melancholic migrant is one who refuses to forget the suffering associated with experiences of racism in the UK. This migrant resists integration. Extending Ahmed's melancholic migrant with Kalina Gottman's observations of 1930s dance marathons where exhausted dancers kept moving or barely shuffling in a zombie state to stay in the competition, I've suggested that zombie migrants are compelled to achieve self-actualization by demonstrating their ability to contribute intellectually, economically, creatively at a pre-established rhythm, achieving career milestones based on Home Office approved routes to indefinite leave to remain. Grateful for the opportunity to live and work in the UK, even as conditions to remain become ever more exploitative and demanding, zombie migrants exert themselves towards constant demonstration of their exceptionalism, working beyond the point of exhaustion to realize the dream they had come to fulfill. During COVID-19 lockdown, the same sculpture of fear has changed to represent my fear of losing loved ones in Singapore. So, returning to the workshop, participants are invited to position themselves in relation to the sculpture. First, avoiding the fear, as you can see in this picture. Then becoming acquainted with the fear. And finally, taking a step towards working through their fears. They can make one change to their fear sculpture before positioning themselves to create an image that represents a step towards working through their fears. And then, as an optional task, participants are invited to create an Art du Déplacement-inspired movement path that links all three images. I send them two examples of what this might look like. One is the comedy sketch by The Office. The other is of Lauren Piemontosi using Art du Déplacement to evoke beauty through playful movement on and around a neglected park bench. Following Maggie, the movement paths are intended as ways of making the familiar strange while exploring how we might begin to work through our own fears. In this pandemic, I've used my Art du Déplacement-inspired performance practice to interrogate my own assumptions of connection, as in what care looks like, and citizenship. In creating my Art du Déplacement-inspired movement journey between two chairs, the sofa and the coffee table, I became sensitized to the distance between the sofa and the coffee table. It's much further than I had anticipated, and the fallen chair would break if I put my weight on its legs. So, while performances of air travel might have once described time spent in transit as the zero time of transit that offers a haven of sorts, this is no longer the case in these COVID-19 times. With quarantine, the 14-day, 13-hour journey from London to Singapore offers no haven at all. There is no guarantee of being reunited with loved ones. In the UK, I talked to an international student who had lost her grandmother during the COVID-19 lockdown. She recommended sending food to help with basic things that we need to function. And so, inspired by this advice, I sent comfort food, curry puffs, fish balls, prawn nuggets, and chicken wings to my cousin in lieu of being present for my uncle's funeral. Care in the hope of a curry puff that is digested as comfort in the body of the mourner that is often neglected in grief. On the day of the live workshop, we talked through the fear sculptures sent by the participants. I begin by talking the participants through a process of describing and then interpreting a fear sculpture. Again, I tell them, you do not have to explain what your fear sculptures mean. Then I share sculptures created by the participants and invited everyone to type in words that they associate with the picture in the Zoom chat that we share. I share my word associations too. I then ask the participants, so what have you learned about your fear? Responses range from my fear is not my fault to I've been through the worst of it now and I can face my fears stronger. When I invited one participant to kind of elaborate what he had learned, he said, you know, no matter what you do, you're always negotiating your fear. Sometimes you're winning over it. Sometimes it's winning over you. It's always there, always on top of you. Sometimes you face it and sometimes you ignore it. And it's always hanging there. There have been quite a few sculptures that also suggest a fear of death. One participant had arranged the chairs around her such that they evoked a casket. She was lying down in the middle of the chairs with her hands folded over her chest. When I mentioned this, one participant said, there was a period in my life where I was very aware of death, but you cannot fear it. That's what I learned in a very shocking way, which very much disturbed me. But that's part of life, to die. I invited him to elaborate on his present perspective, and he spoke of the loss of a close friend to suicide. And he said, When I was looking at my friend, lifeless, I just remembered that yesterday night at 3 a.m. we were laughing and talking about all the best movies, and this could happen to me, which then for a very long time made me very suicidal and depressed. I was so much afraid of dying that I stopped living. Nothing in life is certain but dying. And that changed the way I look at death. I think, okay, I'm going to die, doesn't matter when, but we're not going to live 500 years. So until I'm done, I have to promise myself that I live, and that will make my time worthwhile. Otherwise, I am already dead. So this participant's acceptance of death as a certainty of life and subsequent acceptance of life as impermanent resonates with Graham Park's ideas on living with conscious awareness of the impermanence of life. In accepting that life is brief and that it is impossible to avoid death, one begins to live differently. For Parks, this involves renouncing the immortality of the soul and also the substantiality of the ego by seeing through the illusion of duration. When one accepts that there is no soul that endures, then one begins to reevaluate the desire to leave legacies, to remind future generations of our achievements. For this participant, his appreciation of life as impermanent has renewed his commitment to living. He said, "The beauty of death is that when it's going to happen, you will be not there. I won't be there, and being sad, being depressed, being fearful is a certificate that you are living, which is a good thing." This acceptance of one's mortality seems to prompt a different relationship to fear. So this participant seems to understand fear without being controlled by fear, in a sense that echoes Parks when he notes that it's all over, but somehow, so far at least, it is all back too. Fear has become part of this participant's renewed commitment to living. I resonate with this participant's reflections on death. Accepting my own mortality has enabled me to let go of the desire to establish legacies. In contemplating my own death, I have become more attuned to the impermanence of all living things, and this has displaced my fear of my own death. And Nishitani Keiji observed that death should not be understood as an anticipated event that removes one from the world of the living. Rather, death is something that we bring into the world with us at the moment we are born. Extending Nishitani's understanding of death and life as coexistent in all living things, I suggest that this understanding of living as death in life might also be understood as a kind of mobility. At the end of these Art du Déplacement-inspired workshops, I asked, so what would you say or do to comfort someone who has lost a loved one? These are the responses I've gathered over the online session so far. I'm always here to listen. I'm always here if you need anything. I'm here whenever you need me. I'm here. If you need to talk, I'm here. I'm here when you need me. I'm with you. I'm sorry. I'm here with you. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for your loss. How are you? I'm sorry for your loss. I'll be around if you need anyone, anytime. I don't know what to say. It's very shit. You're so powerful. Gone but not forgotten. You'll be in my heart. I will see you soon. Things will be fine. We will be together eventually. And even if we don't, it's also okay. I am here for you. I am here for you. I am here for you. I'm here for you. I am here for you if you need me. Yet in some sense, I'm here for you amidst this distance between us. I am here while you are there in a place that I am not. But perhaps I am here for you can also mean I am anywhere you are online. Grief is shape-shifting, constantly changing, so the experience of grief is never the same. And I find myself awkwardly comforting those who want to be comforted, being here for loved ones in the form of curry puffs and other comfort foods that are always a little too much, always a little unwanted initially by those who have lost their appetite to grief, but hopefully appreciated later when mourners are too tired to cook. Perhaps this is what being here means at this time. Perhaps I place too much importance on the performance of familiar rituals in person, even when some perform these rituals because they have ceased to care. So inspired by these words of comfort and support, I wrote a chalk poem on the pavement one lockdown weekend. The first line invites passers-by to fill in the blanks with their own imaginations of and hopes for the city. My fear of losing loved ones cannot be displaced by the art of displacement. Borrowing from Judith Butler's observations on being undone by grief, perhaps this fear of losing loved ones displays the thrall in which our relations with others hold us. This fear of losing loved ones reveals the extent to which we are interdependent. In this pandemic, perhaps distance has become a form of care. Hugs that once brought comfort are now experienced as a kind of conflicted intimacy. Touch can be a deadly form of self-gratification in this pandemic, where distance is appreciated as consideration. A new understanding of distance as care has emerged in this time of loss, and keeping our distance, social distancing, physical distancing, or safe distancing, has become the new way in which we show care for each other. Geographical estrangement has forced me to care more in these virtual memorial places created with my family online. In this pandemic, distance is not a void or absence. It is filled with care. So this is where I've got to my writing and thinking for now. And as you all know, it's been intense adapting innovatively to the teaching of theatre online. Juggling working from home, caring for loved ones, has meant that women academics have had less time for writing. And this has been reflected in the reduced number of works published in academic journals by women since March. So I'd like to dedicate the remaining time to a little bit of writing, if you will. Have a look around you and note down 3 colors. Just pay attention to the things you don't often notice around you. Next, write down something you would say or do to comfort someone who has lost a loved one. And finally, think about how your hopes for research have shifted with the pandemic. And write down 1 hope for the academic year ahead. Then if you would like, you can put this together as a sort of loose haiku, 3 lines long, sometimes with 5 syllables in the first line, 7 syllables in the second line, and then 5 syllables in the third line. I just find the syllables helpful sometimes to keep the writing ambiguous enough to share, but it's completely up to you. So the first line could be something you would say or do to support or comfort someone. The second line could be your hope for your research in the year ahead and just work in one of the colors that you noted earlier. And the third line could be a description of the weather. And then you can work in 2 colors. And it doesn't have to be today's weather. And when you feel ready, just press send in the chat box. And if you've pressed send, just take some time to read through what other people have written. Maybe this is also something that speaks to you and the losses you've had. And that's all.